Good evening. My name is Malcolm Young, and I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Forum Fall Season. My guest this afternoon, or tonight in the UK, is the Very Reverend David Monteith, the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, England's first cathedral. Canterbury Cathedral is a unique place of worship. It's a major pilgrimage destination, a masterpiece of art and architecture, and one of the UK's most visited historic sites. It is the principal seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who leads the Church of England and the worldwide Anglican Communion, of which the Episcopal Church in the US is part. What is the role of the cathedral in times like these? Cathedrals have a distinctive capacity and calling to bring people of all spiritual and political backgrounds together to pray, mourn, learn, and act in times of crisis and change. Today, we'll be talking about the cathedral's unique role and the ministry of cathedrals in our time. David, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to be with you, Malcolm, and with everybody else.
Yeah, what time is it there?
It's about 9 o'clock in the evening, and it's a dark and rather cold and wet evening here in Canterbury.
We're very glad that you made time for us today. I know for me, I'm such a morning person. I'm just not very good at 9 o'clock. So I really appreciate you putting us on your schedule for today. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you decided to get ordained when you first did.
Oh gosh, that's a big story. So I grew up in Northern Ireland. I was born in 1968, which meant that my really formative years were during the worst of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I grew up in a Christian home, part of the Church of Ireland, which is also part of the Anglican Communion, which is interesting. It's a kind of church that sat in the sort of middle of the political difficulties in Ireland between Unionists and Republicans, between Protestants and Catholics, and so on. And I suppose that formed me in the faith. But it was when I was at university, and one of my friends from time back in Ireland died in a bombing in Enniskillen on Remembrance Sunday, and her father, Gordon Wilson, who was a very faithful Methodist in the community, he publicly forgave the IRA for what they did to his family. And that was a real moment of revelation for me in working out that the gospel could change people's lives in such a way as to really turn a story right round. And I think that really brought to life in me a sense of vocation and wanting to be a priest, and particularly wanting to work in those places and communities where there was difference and diversity and where people were struggling to live well together.
You know, I love that you brought that up, because I mean, I just think of you, you've been a public figure for so long now, and you've been, people have been very critical of you in very public ways. And I wonder what advice you have as somebody who's for people who want to forgive and people who want to be forgiven too.
So, I mean, I'm very much with the theologian Bonhoeffer when he says, you know, when he writes advising against cheap grace. And cheap forgiveness is a very dangerous thing as well. Forgiveness is an extraordinarily complex thing. It's a huge liberation when it's possible. But in my experience and in my listening to others, it can't be forced. And I think, you know, I remember meeting Desmond Tutu on a number of occasions and being struck so often by him with the sense that forgiveness for him wasn't so much about, you know, doing the right thing per se, and not even doing the right thing in the light of the teaching of Jesus, but him working out really that if he didn't forgive, that he himself was going to be destroyed by this. And so I think forgiveness is a big personal choice, and we can't force others into it. And it's nearly always a long journey. It's very, very rarely a moment. Be very suspicious indeed if you think you could sort something with real forgiveness in a moment. It's usually a long, long trek.
Yeah, I mean, I think of forgiveness as being able to leave the past in the past. And I think that that's a hard thing for us to do, because it's hard for us to be freed from our past.
Very hard. And also, I suppose I would nuance it a bit even further, Malcolm. And I agree with you that it has to be in the past, but the stuff that's in our past we still carry with us. It's like the wound you get from being a little kid and you fall and you cut your knees badly, and your knees are never the same again, but yet they work quite well, and but they're scarred. And I think it's something like that. The scars tell you something's happened, but the impact of them is kind of no more. And I think that's, for me, when I know I've got to the place of forgiveness, when I can look at it and not be afraid to look at it and not be impacted by looking at it, but yet still be able to look at it and not deny it.
Yeah, that's lovely, David. Thank you so much. We're following the Revised Common Lectionary, so we've had 2 Sundays, which are, the gospel readings are just about forgiveness, and that's a wonderful addition to what we talked about as a cathedral here in San Francisco. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is, what do you love about being a cathedral dean? Like, what excites you about it?
Well, for me personally, I've kind of worked out it's the right sort of size jacket to wear, as it were. I just kind of feel that this is the kind of the role that's so good for me, in which I thrive. And I think part of that is I feel as if I've got one foot in the church and one foot in the world. And when I was first ordained, I used to think that was the case for every priest. That would be the way it would be. But actually, I found as a parish priest, a local vicar or whatever, that to be, even though I always wanted that to be the case, one foot in the world, one foot in the church, more and more I was finding my feet in the church, running the church, looking after the church community, fundraising for the church, all the things that require to run the church. And there was no time to actually be out and about and making connection. Whereas I think being a dean allows me to do both things legitimately. It's kind of in my job description. And it's one of the things I look at my diary and test my diary on every so often to see just how many hours are in church and how many out in the community.
I love that. And I think when I first was ordained, I felt very strongly, I loved the Episcopal Church, but I wanted it to be there for other people, not just church people.
Yeah, but I suppose also I know, and I worked out that in our situation we have archdeacons who work very closely with the bishops. I suppose they're a bit like canons of the ordinary, I guess, is something that like that with you, and people like that who are peripatetic, like bishops, are out and about all the time, never having really a proper base. And I worked out, for me, I need a base. I need a community in which I can live and pray day by day. And if I've got that in place, then I can do this sort of dance between church and world really well.
What do you think makes an effective dean? Like, what makes someone really succeed as a dean?
Well, I'm not sure I personally know the answer to that.
You can always just pass.
But I can talk about theory, at least, I suppose. I think one of the questions I ask myself a lot is, what are the things only the dean can do? And that's often quite clarifying, because I guess a dean is there to hold the space for everybody and to kind of create the ecology in which ministry and life and creativity and all the other things can flourish. And so that's a fine balance between knowing enough about the day-to-day operations of a place and how a place ticks and works, and yet standing back always into the kind of this more strategic place, really. I read, well, like you, probably, Malcolm, I've read many books on leadership, and there was one of them that really struck me, and I've forgotten who it was by now, but it said basically that really good leadership comprised of 3 things. One is saying thank you, 2 is saying sorry, and 3 is telling the big story. Mm. And I think I agree with that, in terms of that's the ministry of the dean. Whether any of us can do it well is another question entirely.
That was beautiful. Thank you. You have so many beautiful things that are in Canterbury Cathedral. Can you talk about some of your favorite pieces of art that are there at the cathedral?
Well, I'm getting to know the cathedral. It's a really kind of big and complex place to get to know artistically and the rest of it. Well, there's one thing that really strikes me. Canterbury Cathedral, from the west end to the east end, you go up series after series of steps, which would take you right up to the east end of the building, where originally the shrine of Thomas Becket was, but with that real sense of arriving on a pilgrimage, which kind of mirrors our earthly pilgrimage, baptism, being fed by the word and the sacraments, then on into the vision of heaven. That platform which often underlies many Christian buildings. But outside the pulpitum arch, which is where the nave and the choir in the cathedral meet, and there's this great stone screen. If you stand on that and look west, you see the most spectacular medieval window, which is one of the windows in the cathedral which tells stories about the ancestors of Jesus. And right at the bottom of it is the figure of Adam with a spade. It's in the way of those medieval windows that almost look contemporary, as if somebody, David Hockney has just put it there or something like that. But I try and look at that window every day, because surrounded by such power of architecture and story, and the weight of the history of the place and the stories of the Archbishop and the weight of the Anglican Communion, all those things, they can start having, I think, a negative effect on those of us who live and work here. We can begin to think of ourselves far more than we should do, and so on. And so that's a piece of art that kind of transforms my heart daily. In the end, I am Adam too, made from clay, dust of the earth. And in fact, there's in the cloister garth here, which is the green space in the middle of the cloisters, that's where archbishops and deans and canons get buried. So I kind of walk past that regularly as well, thinking, that's where I'm heading, back into the soil.
Yeah.
And those two things are the things that speak to me most at the moment. Even though there are many probably more spectacular pieces of art and so on in the building, they're the ones that are really resonant.
I remember that image of Adam with the spade from visiting, and I'm so embarrassed to say that I never thought of just the shape of our cathedrals being the same, where you entered through the baptism, we were fed by the communion table, and then in our choir, that is an image of heaven, and even song there to me feels like heaven. So you've changed my perspective on Grace Cathedral in a way I didn't think I was going to be transformed in that way today.
Well, that's good. I mean, I think the people who thought up these buildings really they knew their spirituality and theology really well, I think.
Yeah, me too. And the buildings are functioning in the way they intended them to. Could you talk a little bit about who your spiritual heroes are?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Well, Francis of Assisi is certainly one of the people I draw a lot of inspiration from, and I kind of hold him in tension with Benedict. So I've got both of their icons on my wall here in my study. So there's something, as I've already said, something about the stability of a Benedictine community and the outreach and the work with the poor and the vulnerable, which Francis embodies. So those are certainly two very important people to me. Who else would I? Well, I like poetry a lot, and I think Grace Cathedral's been thinking about poetry. I think I read that somewhere.
Poetry, exactly. Yeah. This is the perfect question.
So I like contemporary poetry a lot, and so including Irish contemporary poetry. So the writings of Seamus Heaney and Patrick Kavanagh and people like that really matter to me. But also from America, I was devastated the day that Mary Oliver died. Absolutely devastated, and I sometimes long to have Wendell Berry in my cupboard here in my office, that I could just open the door and he could just say a few words and go back into being a Kentucky farmer again. Those are some of the people, but there's a long list.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's perfect. Seamus Heaney, we used to see him a lot when we were at Harvard. His office was right above my wife's office.
Right. Yeah. I'm not very good at being a groupie generally, and I used to work at St Martin in the Fields in the centre of London, where I would see lots of actors and famous people all the time. But there was one day when I was in the post office adjacent to the church, I think sending off a birthday card to my sister or something like that, and Seamus Heaney was 3 in front of me in the queue, and I just became this little boy who just had to say, "I'm really sorry to disturb you because you're having your own life, but I've got to talk to you." And that was one of the big moments of my life, meeting Seamus Heaney face to face like that.
I laugh about that all the time because my wife does know who all the actors and actresses are. I don't know any of them. But you're right. If I saw Mary Oliver, or we have same thing with the cathedral, or it draws people who are prominent literary and theological figures. So I love seeing them. So one of the things, there's Christian Century is a magazine in North America, and they have this recurring article called "How My Mind Has Changed." I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how your theological views have changed over time, your philosophical views. Just how do things look like when you kind of get to your mid-50s?
Yeah. So I suppose a big part of my formative Christian years were in quite conservative Christian ways, and more evangelical settings of the church, largely because in the communities I was part of, they were the places where there was life and energy in a way that there wasn't always in some of the other churches. And from that, I did develop a real love for the Bible, I have to say. And that really hasn't left me at all. And in fact, one of my great frustrations often is how unseriously the church takes the Bible now. And I wouldn't read it in the same way as I did as a young man, and would be able to read it now more metaphorically and poetically, and all the other ways that one reads the scriptures. But I'm constantly amazed at how little the Bible features in much of our worship, even in our Anglican worship. I've been to churches where the Bible's hardly read aloud. Maybe some quotes are made in the sermon and so on, and that bothers me quite a lot, I have to say. So that's one area that's been important to me. Like many of my generation, I think I've learned to read the Bible through the eyes of others, which was never something that was part of my growing up. So whether that's through the eyes of women, or through the eyes of the poor, or through the eyes of people of global majority heritage, or through queer eyes, or whatever. And I find, I don't always find those readings absolutely convincing, but I find them very illuminating, and profoundly questioning of wherever I've got to along that road. And I'm going to say something now which is dangerous, particularly if the sort of media headline people get hold of a Dean of Canterbury saying something like this. But I think I believe more and more about less and less. So, the real core of the faith, the real existence of God, the historical reality of Christ, the gift of the Spirit, the death and resurrection, those things I believe in more and more. But a lot of the other stuff around, I'm less bothered about it, I suppose. And because I'm less bothered about it, I suppose I understand belief not as something theoretical or just about what I have in my head, but belief is about how I'm living. So I ask myself how I'm living, and I'm living more and more into those big core central doctrines and stories, and less in some of the periphery.
Yeah, I think the further I go down, I think that's lovely. But I think the further I go down the road, the barriers seem lower between us and an experience of God. I think a lot of us, I think that's a lot of what our work is to do, is to help remove barriers, because people think, well, I can't believe because of X, and you can believe even with X. And I think that's a large part of just what our calling is as clergy in the 21st century.
And I think, it's been said many times before, but I think a lot of Christian people actually live really as agnostics or atheists, really, and because the belief hasn't changed them in ways that could be identifiable, really. Whereas I'm interested in trying to find ways to live faithfully. I think it was Walter Brueggemann who, way back, coined the phrase. He talked about post-critical naivety. Post-critical naivety. So you still have to go through all the questioning stuff, but you have to get to a point of, am I living trustfully in the light of the theology that I'm espousing, or is this just an intellectual game for me? And it's less and less a game for me. And maybe that's because, I'm now 55 and nearer one end of life than the other.
That's really true. We're pretty close to being exact contemporaries, you and me. That's what makes your conversation so interesting. During your first year at Canterbury, what are some of the things that surprised you when you arrived? I mean, you'd already been the dean of Leicester Cathedral, so you'd experienced that. But what were some of the things that you didn't expect?
Well, I kind of knew in my head it was going to be more complex, and we have 250 staff here at Canterbury. We have about 500 volunteers, and obviously we have stakeholders who are local, national, international, and so on. So I knew there would be a level of complexity, but I think what I didn't realize was the impact that COVID really had on this place for a number of years, and a number of other factors played into it as well. But that meant that, for example, the financial stability of the cathedral suddenly was questioned, and still is questioned.
I remember visiting there and just learning that 2/3 of the cathedral income was coming from tourism. And when the cathedral's closed, there's absolutely no tourists. It made me very grateful that we have a diversity of different sources of income here, but it must have been devastating. I mean,
that was really devastating. Yeah, really devastating. And actually, it's interesting that it's the oldest cathedral foundations that were worst affected, because they're the ones most reliant on tourism. So St. Paul's and York Minster and us and Westminster Abbey, for example, are all the ones that were most badly affected by that. So that's been a big thing. I think another thing that's been interesting for me is that I suppose I assumed that the town of Canterbury and the community of the county of Kent in which we're set would just automatically have a fondness towards Canterbury Cathedral, because it is so extraordinary. It's been at the heart of this place. Been, a version of it's been here since 597. You take Canterbury Cathedral out of Canterbury and it just becomes another little town. So I kind of assumed that there was a kind of a contract or a covenant, maybe more a covenant between the people of the community and the cathedral. But I think that had broken down quite a lot as well. And we're not helped here by the fact that although it's beautiful, we sit surrounded by medieval walls. So it's like living in the inside of a castle or something, and you have to go through big gates to come in and out. So the natural porosity, which is part of a cathedral's life, is mediated through gates and walls and barriers and so on. Indeed, when I first arrived, one of our chapter members, who I guess is the equivalent of your trustees, said to me that when she started as a trustee, she thought the walls and the gates were to keep the hoi polloi out, but then realized it was to keep the inmates in. And so there's something about those dynamics that are quite hard to work through and to really make really concerted efforts to reconnect the cathedral with the life of the city and the community. And so that struck me. And then I think the final thing, and I think this is a disease that goes on in many churches and certainly in many cathedrals and in other communities, because we're made up of groups of people who have huge expertise in different areas. We have some of the finest medieval stained glass in the world, and we have a wonderful group of conservators and people who work in glass. We have a wonderful group of stonemasons and people who work in stone. We have people who work in wood, and we have visitor people. We have hospitality people. We have musicians. All these different people. They're all doing great stuff, but it's very easy for them not to connect with one another and to become quite siloed in the way they think about things. But I suppose because I come in with a kind of theology which wants to find continuities and look out for God in every situation and not think of that being kind of the holy bit and that being the secular bit. What I've been trying to do is sort of introduce groups of people to one another. And I actually think that is sharing in the bishop's ministry, because obviously the cathedral has been the location for the bishop's chair. And one of the historic ways in which a bishop is described as pontifex, as a bridge,
Right.
who was connecting one community with another. So there's a sense of overall Catholicity. Well, within the life of the cathedral itself, I feel as if we need to do a lot of work on that so that we begin to really support one another, but also begin to kind of get really creative with where those interdisciplinary moments happen. Because that's where there's a lot of energy and a lot of interesting things that could emerge.
Yeah, it's even our own chapter meeting this yesterday. We were having a conversation about architecture and about the different tasks, different projects that we have lined up for the future. And it was very helpful to have the new canon for music there to be able to chime in and to have input and to help us to understand some of these things. So you're right. There is a power when you gather everybody together, and we can learn so much from each other, even across different departments.
Yeah. And even in a very trivial way, and when you are a community, often it's some quite small things that become really annoying. There was a group of management consultants a few years ago, I think in the University of Oxford, who tried to do some work on, what was the real essence of the University of Oxford, and what held the whole thing together. And actually, they couldn't find anything in terms of scholarship or tradition or any of those things. The only thing they found common to every conversation they had was a hate around car parking. So in other words, if you kind of manage to kind of do something about the car parking situation, you might actually do something to kind of bring a new sense of cohesion. And actually, if you could turn all of that anger about the fact you can't park into something creative, can you imagine how much better the University of Oxford would be? So I kind of look out for these points where there's kind of grating of things, because they're quite revealing moments.
Yeah, definitely. So there's so many famous historical figures that are associated with Canterbury. What stories do you like to tell about the cathedral's history, or particular figures in the cathedral's history?
Well, it's hard not to tell the story about Becket, of course, because it's so seminal to the place. Becket in the court of the king, and then the king choosing him as archbishop because he thinks that the king will have a great advocate there, right at the heart of the church. But Becket becomes infused with the gospel and with his concern to keep the church able to speak its own voice, and therefore is killed as a result in his own cathedral, and then very quickly becomes this saint figure, the route of pilgrimage, and the one around whom all these stories of miracle begins to happen. So he's one of the people who it's difficult to avoid in Canterbury. And I'm kind of interested in the fact that what is it about his story which in the end really brought people here? And sometimes people wax lyrical about pilgrimage itself, and pilgrimage is a really important thing. Lots of people are rediscovering it and walking from here to, on the Camino to Santiago, to Compostela, or off to Rome or whatever. But as pilgrimage was understood in medieval times, people went because they thought they were going to be changed in some way, and they thought they were going to be changed by God in some way. And so that's a story I feel as if we need to drill down a bit more deeply into. I'm also learning a lot about some of the figures some of the stories that aren't told terribly well. And there's a rake of stories about women that I haven't really got into yet, and in Canterbury, which we need to reveal. But there's also stories about people like, for example, Theodore, who was the 6th or the 7th Archbishop of Canterbury, whose day actually was just the other day. And he was a great reformer within the church and gave to the Church of England really our parish and diocesan system that we still have a version of today. But his co-collaborator, the prior of Canterbury at the time, so the deans originally were priors. So the prior at the time was Hadrian, and both Theodore and Hadrian were North Africans. Hadrian was a Libyan, and Theodore also from North Africa. And so the fact that right in the early days of the story of the Anglican way, we had this international aspect to our life, which shaped the vision for the church here in all kinds of ways. And indeed, there was a great school of theology, the Canterbury School of Theology in the 7th and 8th century, which basically shaped and formed every Benedictine abbot in the whole of England. Now, I find those stories very inspiring because I'm just at the early stages of trying to work out what on earth Canterbury Cathedral is for, and what kind of formation might we be able to offer others, and particularly what does that look like in something of a decolonized world and something of a decolonized communion, where power is clearly moving in our world to the south, and we're obviously entering great times of ecological crisis, wherein there will be different kinds of leadership required of the church. So those are some of the stories that have hit me early on, but I've only been here 10 months, and there's plenty more to find.
There is. It's going to be interesting to watch as you uncover new stories going forward. Could you talk a little bit about how the church is doing in the UK? What signs of hope and what signs of change are you seeing these days?
Okay. I would say that we're struggling. So at one level, the secularization that's been going on in Europe, certainly since the Second World War, but probably from the First World War, that process continues. And if anything, COVID and so on has accelerated that. So I guess, as in some churches in the States, not everybody has come back to church. And I think there are clergy out there thinking that eventually, if we keep on doing what we do and keep on doing it well, they will come back. I have my doubts about that. I think there are new patterns of life have been established, which are quite difficult to shift. And some of the challenges we faced as a church, which we've known about for a long time, again, have really been accelerated by COVID. So particularly the rural church, if you drive around England, every single little village has a beautiful church. It's probably built in the 10th or 12th century, and the village is responsible for it, its upkeep and so on. These are incredibly expensive buildings, and actually often there's a very, very small congregation. So I even notice now that when I go out to take services in the Diocese of Canterbury, that the numbers on an average Sunday are generally less than I would have expected to see in the equivalent places in the Diocese of Leicester, where I was dean there. And I think clergy morale is quite low. All the surveys continue to show that, really. And people, I think, are a bit tired. And I guess lots of people aren't quite trained for the kind of new sort of church leadership that's going to be needed. And partly because we don't exactly know what the new sort of leadership is required. So I think there's a lot of that around. On the other hand, as ever with God, God hasn't abandoned the church at all. There continues to be signs of hope and life and growth. And so, for example, here in this diocese, I would look to the extraordinary work that's going on with refugees and asylum seekers, for example, because we're in Kent and Dover is just 20 miles down the road from Canterbury. And that's the main place where boats arrive from across the channel. And of course, very much shaped by people traffickers and modern day slavery that's going on. And yet care and advocacy being enabled by the church. So things like that give me hope. And also I get a lot of hope when I go into schools and meet young people and young people of faith whose passions about the gospel, about the justice of God's kingdom, and about climate justice, bowl me over every time. I went to a theatre production the other day where it was the adults were put on trial by the kids, and boy, we didn't do well.
For good reason,
yeah. And so there are signs of hope around. We now have we've had women priests in the church for a long time. We now have women bishops. That was long awaited. And we still have a long way to go with wider issues of inclusion, but there are signs of hope around that too.
Yeah. One of the big changes in our lifetimes has just been technological changes with the internet, online video, social media. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about church and these new technologies.
Sure. Well, I suppose Canterbury is one of the success stories around that, because my predecessor, Dean Robert, as many people will know, took to saying morning prayer online. And who would have thought that doing something as simple as that, sitting in the garden, admittedly with his cats and so on, but something really quite simple would connect with so many people around the world. And it clearly did. And we still live cast our morning service on a Sunday and evensong every day. And we still have tens of thousands of people who hook into those programs through the week, and they're clearly important to them. And I get emails every week thanking us for doing that. So at that level, suddenly our reach is hugely broadened. And that's good. And webcasts like this are all part of that as well. And we can do this easily and cheaply, and many people can participate in it. So that's all good. I think it's also a toxic place, the e-world.
Online world, yeah.
The online world is toxic. I see the Archbishop a lot, and I mean, the stuff that goes into his inbox is just unbelievable, and not just from people who have a real gripe about the church or about what Archbishop Justin has said, but by lots of church people as well. Lots of people who are active in their communities who just suddenly lose the grip of decency online. And so I think there's a whole opening up for us is a whole ethical discourse about that. And what are we seeing that's really going on in the human psyche here? And of course, other political movements, populism and so on, have fired this up as well. So it's not just happening accidentally. But then the third thing I would say is that the last time there was a major technological revolution of this scale was the inventing of printing.
Yes.
And with it came the Enlightenment and the Reformation. Many people died, but a fundamental shift and change in every single aspect of human life and society happened. And so I'm not despairing about it all, but I think it's more significant than mostly we have time to give thought to. And there are little blips that appear. So at the moment, I don't know about the media in the States, but we have every day there's another story about AI, about artificial intelligence. And it's usually doom and gloom about artificial intelligence. And, like the rest of them, I can be doomy and gloomy about AI. But it's creative as well, isn't it? It's opening up new ways of thought and identity and so on. I remember having big theological conversations with my colleagues during the thick of lockdown, when we would record at various stages. Sometimes we were doing live worship, and sometimes we were doing recorded worship. And when one does a recorded Eucharist, in what sense is divine presence mediated through that? And those are new and really fascinating questions, which I don't think we can resolve quickly, but we've got to be asking them.
Yeah, it was one of the were interesting questions in the United States. The House of Bishops shut it down so quickly, just like the only real communion is in person, and it was such a knee-jerk response to it. I would have liked to have had more of a conversation about it, like for what reasons? Just because, like you said, it's God's purposes are continually unfolding before us.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn more about God as we learn more about humanity.
Absolutely, and of course, the feedback that people would give from those experiences varied hugely. Often for me, they left me completely cold. I didn't feel connected to them at all. But equally, I would hear from other people that, that they really sensed the presence of God when they gathered in their living room around the TV watching that, and felt the intimacy of encounter with Christ, as I broke the bread. Well, I can't discount all of that, even if the questions are pretty scary sometimes to ask.
Yeah, and I do think it was something we just didn't talk about very much in the American church world, is that everybody at some point you time out of worship life. You're too feeble, you're too old, you can't get there, and we will never abandon those people in the same way that we did before. I mean, we'd send communion ministers, but people really feel like they're part of things in a way that they just wouldn't have been able to a generation ago.
Yeah, absolutely. There remains huge opportunity in it. I think one of the things that's harder to work out is how to create real community online. And this is where I think we need to listen to younger generations much more, because I think they've found good ways of creating community online. But it involves so much effort and so many thumb movements throughout the day that I just can't quite find space to do that in my life. But clearly other people can, and I want to kind of learn from that a bit.
Yeah, how do you move from an experience of watching church like television to one where you are communicating, where your voice is heard and you're recognized for who you are?
Yeah,
that is a huge challenge, I think. It's funny that you mentioned too, just about the Archbishop. And I had an old congregant from 30 years ago, and she read something in the newspaper, and she called my cell phone, left an answering machine message. She was so angry. And I'm like, what do you believe? Do you believe what the newspaper says, or like this relationship that we've had for 30 years? So it is hard to, but maybe you can talk a little bit about just what is your relation to the Archbishop of Canterbury? Like, what is your official relationship, and what is your kind of unofficial one?
Okay. So officially, the Dean of Canterbury is appointed by the Crown. So I'm appointed. In fact, I was appointed by Queen Elizabeth II, but then she died in the time between I'd been appointed and when it was publicly announced, and that caused a bit of a hoo-ha, because they couldn't work out whether or not the King needed to reappoint me, or whether the fact that his mother had already appointed me sufficed. So that was kind of interesting to be part of that moment of history. So I'm appointed by the King, but obviously the Archbishop was involved in the appointment process, which was chaired by a local vice chancellor of a local university here, and involved a huge panel of people and all the rest of it. Typical kind of search process that goes on. And he installed me and licensed me into the life of the cathedral. It's my responsibility to make the cathedral available to him and to the Diocese of Canterbury and to the province of Canterbury, which is the southern province. The Church of England is divided into two provinces, the Canterbury and York. And so my role is to make that available to him. Because we have this sort of interesting bit of history between deans and bishops in the Church of England, there are some days when the Archbishop technically has rights. So he has rights to preach and preside in the cathedral, for example, on the big feast days, on Christmas Day, on the Easter Day, on Pentecost. Technically, on all the other days, he needs to ask my permission to come into the cathedral.
Right.
Now, clearly we don't operate like that. But it is an interesting thing about the balancing the ecology of powers. So I, as the chair of the cathedral chapter, make the decisions about the cathedral. Sometimes when the cathedral does something that people don't like, they all write to the Archbishop. And the Archbishop writes back saying, talk to the Dean. So that's the kind of the official piece. I think the unofficial piece is I'm part of the group of people who care for the Archbishop and who care for the Archbishop's family. And his mother has just recently died. And that's a very significant thing in any of our lives. So that's been important conversations we've had. On the day of the coronation, I get a phone call about sort of 6 p.m. From his car saying we're driving down from London to Canterbury for the next couple of days of rest. Do you have anything fizzy in your fridge for us to drink?
That's great.
Because I need to kick off my shoes and I need to talk to somebody about the day in a way that I can't talk to other people about. So there's those kind of things. And we talk about stuff and we don't always agree, because I think we have a mature relationship with one another, but I try to be a support for him in what he goes through, because I'm so aware of the weight that he carries.
Yeah, I love the way that you talk about that. It's beautiful colleagues relationship. So one of the traditions we have on the forum is we take questions from our viewers, and so I'm receiving questions already. The first one is, perhaps you can speak to the main pulpit itself. The notion of the lineage of those who have stood and preached from that pulpit, to me, is deeply humbling and hopeful, all in and of itself. So a question about the pulpit at Canterbury.
Yes, well, I mean, that pulpit has had extraordinary people in it, both in terms, just take the lineage of the Archbishop of Canterbury for starters. And although the actual pulpit has changed over the years, the space, which is the pulpit of Canterbury, has had some of the wisest voices and some of the silliest voices, if truth be told as well. And so it's interesting. I mean, when I go into it, I do have a sense of that, and particularly, some of the extant collections of sermons and so on that we still have of some of these preachers are very powerful, and they come alive when you kind of, when I read them here in my office, and I think this was preached just over the way, and it still has a degree of resonance. It's also true to say that, and this is the real knack, is how you live with so many ghosts around the place, or in some cases, actual saints, and how you make sure they continue to be friends and not competitors or foes. I think that's the spiritual discipline of preaching here, and therefore to find our own distinctive voice in our day. So when we invite people to preach here, I always say, please, 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 do not think you're preaching in Canterbury Cathedral. Rather think you are simply preaching in front of a congregation of people who need to hear God's word. Don't try and impress us. Don't quote endlessly from other people. Tell us what God is saying to you now in a way that's really going to connect. And but that's quite a hard thing to overcome because of the weight of history.
It is, we have that problem too with people coming to the cathedral. It's hard to know what instructions to give them when they're preaching in the same pulpit that Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, Jane Goodall, there's so many, Angela Davis, Dolores Huerta, so many famous preachers have been here. And it's hard to give instructions about it because it's not easy to get it right the first time.
One of my big things to people is usually to say, whatever you're going to say less than whatever you're going to say, please.
That's great advice. So we have a few other questions that have come through. One is, are there scriptures which resonate with Mary Oliver's poems for you?
Oh, I guess I go to the Psalms in particular, because I think she gets something of the kind of rhythm of the Psalms, and again, I quoted Brueggemann earlier. Brueggemann's work on the Psalms, which he notices this process of what he calls orientation, disorientation, new orientation, the sense of going through a kind of journey and a trajectory to a place of hope. And I read so often in Mary's writings a narrative of hope, and not always necessary in the actual syntax, but in the space of the syntax. And somehow that speaks to me more about the way hope really is. Usually if hope is so explicit, it's more likely to be optimism. And I think optimism and hope are not the same thing. Hope has got a deeper resonance about it because it comes out of the heart of God, and therefore is different. One of my favorite sayings, which I think I quoted in a little video I did when I first became dean, is Miroslav Volf, the theologian. He somewhere describes hope as being love stretched into the future. And that's a phrase I think Mary Oliver could have written.
Right, it does. Here's another question, and this question is for both participants. Is grace, quote unquote, universal? Does everyone, Christian or not, receive the blessing of grace?
I'll go, and I can say the answer to that in one word: yes.
Yep, me too.
Undeniably.
Exactly.
There is no life without grace. Life and grace are, I think, interchangeable words. I mean, I think in John's Gospel, he would probably use the word life rather than grace. But it is that force for good that animates and which makes life worth living and which makes things more than they are. And of course, that in the Christian tradition, that's deeply connected to the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And so the way one comes to it may be by a number of different lenses, but it still comes in and through the life of God as revealed in Christ. That's my answer.
And I think of grace as being all the things you said. And I think of grace as being a kind of gift that we don't deserve and oftentimes don't expect. And you're right. I mean, I also think of the word light in the Gospel of John. Light came into the world. And I think all human beings recognize what light is and understand what darkness is. And we are so afflicted in our different ways in the darkness, that we take joy when we see those signs of light. Even this question, I'm grateful for the participant and thinking about that and being concerned about all human beings and not just. I think Christianity is at its worst when it becomes a kind of form of identity or a club instead of a group of people on the way who are inspired by the teaching of Jesus.
I think sometimes we things have to break through our carapace for us to notice these things. And at one point in my past, when I was working in central London, I was working a lot with homeless people there, and often it was working with the most vulnerable in society, that I was able to receive and encounter grace most profoundly. And I think, that connects for me with the kind of the story of the Annunciation, is who is the good news announced to? First of all, and it's the little and the lost and the least and all of that. So, if I'm not in touch in some way regularly with those who, in whatever way, experience that sense of poverty of means, or poverty of spirit, or poverty of life, I think I'm less likely to notice the grace. Whereas I think the grace streams constantly to the least, and therefore, from a very selfish point of view, that's why I want to be with them, because they're one of the means whereby I know more of God.
Right. Here's another question. You've succeeded the longstanding and beloved Dean Willis. Is there something that he imparted to you, either spiritually or practically, in your role as dean of such a historic cathedral?
Well, it's interesting that we've just been talking about the word grace, because I think Robert was extraordinarily graceful in all kinds of ways. He just kind of, in his body, he somehow carried a sense of grace. And, I've known him for a very long time, both as the Dean of Leicester, and then, in the College of Deans and so on. And he just had that sort of, I don't know, that underlying confidence and trust in God that came through in the way he received people here, in the way he spoke in the liturgy, in the way he preached. And that stands before me. I wish I could be quite as apparently centered as Robert is, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, all the ways you describe Robert are the ways we experience you. I'm very grateful for you taking the time for this conversation. I learn a lot about just church life from my spouse. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you learned from your partner, and just in terms of that it affected your ministry, and which kind of sustains you, etc.
Yeah. Well, that's a very pertinent question, because we've been together for a very long time, and we're very old and boring these days. But actually, one of the things that's happened to us is that when I started here in December, and in February he had a stroke out of the blue.
I'm sorry.
He's a therapist by training, working in palliative care, and actually, for both of us, whilst we have not wanted this to be part of our lives, he's had to give up his work and so on, and it's just all seemed wrong, given having just arrived in Canterbury and all the rest of it. But that's also been, in a way, good for me as well, because it keeps me, that personal relationship is also so important to me. And it's very easy in these big roles, as you will know, Malcolm, where our work just takes over our lives. But now, having a spouse who has a degree of vulnerability means that I need to pay much more attention to him, as well as to other things. And in a way, that's a funny, surprising gift. And I'm glad of it.
Well, he's so lucky to have you. And I think you're lucky to have him too. I mean, what a blessing it is. I think you're able to be an agent of grace in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you didn't have each other.
He's the much nicer one.
I always joke about that with my brother. If you had looked at the two of us when we were 10 years old and asked which one's going to be the priest, it would have been.
Absolutely.
Oh, David, it's been such a joy to spend this time with you. I hope that that the two of you can come out to San Francisco, and we would love to have you here. It seems like a very great distance. Yeah, even just watching the lights go off over your shoulder and the cathedral fade into the darkness makes me realize just how far apart we are, and yet I'm so grateful that we were brought together by these technologies.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's been a joy to be part of this evening, and please, folks, do come and see us, and we love welcoming people. Do join us here.
Yeah. Please join me on Sunday in person at 9:30 a.m. when my guest will be Lee Herrick, California's 10th Poet Laureate and the first Asian American to serve in the role in the Year of Poetry at Grace Cathedral. We'll be talking about poetry as a bridge to social justice and its enduring power. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give online at gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, THINK, to 76278. 76278. And again, thanks so much, Dean David Monteith. We're so grateful that we could be together today.
Thank you. Good night.
Night, everyone.